Interesting discussion yesterday in the wake of the overturning of a murder conviction for a woman called Gail Manning who spent 16 years in prison for her crime. And though he'd never heard of the case before, I mentioned to Ben that when I grew up, Arthur Thomas, and I'm not going to call him Arthur Allen Thomas because that's what you call criminals, you read their middle name, and Arthur Thomas, wrongly convicted of the Crew murders back in, 1970, I think it was. And it used to be I lived in a country where that was really the only time that we absolutely knew about that our cops were bent or someone got fitted up. But it seems to me there is now a growing list of people, and let's just stick with murder, who have been wrongly convicted or convicted under very questionable circumstances. David Doherty, Tainapura, where the list is huge, and now Gail. One of the people often involved in investigating and bringing these tragedies, these miscarriages of justice to light is a former copper called Tim McKinnel. He's turned private investigator. And I'm really glad to welcome Tim onto the program to talk about not the specifics of any one case, Tim, but the fact that our age of innocence in terms of our belief in a pretty well uncorruptible police force, I've got to say it's shaken when we now look at the numbers and the roll call of wrongful or overturned murder convictions.
Morning, Sean. Yeah, it's troubling. I think the word you used in your intro there is apt, and these are tragedies. They ought to have never happened. They don't only impact those that are convicted and sent to prison for crimes they haven't committed, but they affect victims' families enormously as well. Decades later, they're forced to relive these terrible cases, and we need to do something about it.
Yeah, Tim, you have been involved in a lot of these cases. You've done excellent work, and I commend you for it. Is there a common theme or a common denominator when murder cases go wrong and the wrong person ends up behind bars? Can you point to one or two factors that seem to be similar in these investigations and cases?
Yep, globally there are recognised risk factors for miscarriages of justice, and we're no different. We're no more special here in New Zealand than anywhere else. They're exactly the same things that cause wrongful convictions around the world, and they are things like flawed identification evidence, false confessions, non-disclosure of crucial evidence, flawed scientific evidence. These are all things that feature regularly in wrongful conviction cases, both internationally and here. The other thing, which is a slightly softer issue, which is what we're starting to see here, is myopia and tunnel vision in both
in investigation terms.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you decide that's who did it. Let's find the facts that fit that narrative. It's like bad journalism, actually, Tim, in a strange way. All those things, flawed, false, flawed, they are natural mistakes that occur, right? And we can watch for them. I'd suggest I'm looking more for things that are, if you like, proactive mistakes, non-disclosure or officers deciding to withhold evidence, because there is, if you like, benign mistakes and sort of malignant mistakes, deliberate miscarriages of justice, deliberate warping of evidence, or interfering with the defence in a murder case. And Tim, I think you look at Arthur Thomas's case, and you say there were bent coppers there who were doing the wrong thing. We all know about Hutton. We all know about the Cartridge case and the questionability about that. That seemed to be a proactive miscarriage of justice. And that's a cultural issue. Has that changed? Has that got any better? Has it got worse?
I think that it's a steady state. I don't think it has changed. My position generally is you take cops and or prosecutors as you find them, and so I think you probably want to avoid making sweeping statements and stereotypes. But there are undoubtedly elements within our criminal justice system that perhaps don't set out to convict innocent people, but are indifferent to the risks they take when they do naughty things. And that is what we're seeing over and over again in these cases. And then when those things are identified, we have a strategy of minimisation.
And that's the thing. You do not modify behaviours unless there are repercussions and consequences. And Tim, do you think there are real repercussions and consequences for investigating officers and prosecuting officers who skew the pitch?
In short, no, not sufficiently so. Accountability is incredibly important. That's what our justice system is about for citizens. It needs to apply those principles of accountability equally to officers of the law, law enforcement officers, judicial officers when they get it wrong. And I think for far too long our justice system has had as a priority protection of itself. Right.
Okay. I hear exactly what you're saying there. Are there more cases that you're working on? We look at Gail Maney's the latest one to hit the headlines. Are there more underway?
Yeah, well, it's recently been reported that some people involved in Alan Hall's wrongful conviction and prosecution have been criminally charged. In terms of future cases, absolutely. We need to fix what has happened to Stephen Stone. He remains in prison, and with the prospect of a theoretical retrial for Gail Maney in the Gail Maney case. But beyond that, I'm involved in several other cases where I think that innocent people have or continue to spend time in prison.
Tim, you used to be a copper, right?
I did.
Right, and now you're kind of like chasing down bad coppers, aren't you, from outside the tent?
Yeah, well, I don't see it quite like that, but...
a lot of people do
sometimes
see it that way.
Yeah, I know. You should see my email inbox.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, this must be a hard job, and is it a satisfying position to be in?
Well, it is when you have your rare victories, but for the most part, it is grindingly slow, painstaking, and frustrating work. And then you have days like we had this week, which, to some extent was tainted by the fact that only 3 out of the 4 were acquitted. So, in my view, that's still just a partial victory for justice. There's more to do. So there's a lot more frustration and hard work than there is satisfaction, but, you have to take a moment and be pleased with results like this week.